Well, this capstone project, which I finished in 2021, October 2021, definitely is born from like my personal experience. I think both of you, all of you probably know parts of my story at least. The very earliest versions of like my mission statement, for instance, were from the Divine Mercy University has you do a flourishing development plan. So just kind of every semester you were doing this project that you added on every single class. And so my very earliest part of my capstone project was coming up with basically what the mission statement is. At the time I was really focused on like the community building aspect of Even This Way. It is a nonprofit now.
Oh wow.
Both with Divine Mercy University and this other like leadership conference that I went to. It was my action plan, kind of those things together, kind of turned this into like a 5-year project, not just, my capstone. But basically the outreach is to what is called sibling survivors. That's what I call us. It's not abortion survivors, which there is ministry for people who, a lot of people know Gianna Jessen, who she survived an abortion, a saline abortion. And then there was Melissa Oden a little bit later. And she does ministry for people who literally survived abortions, whether that be from like failed saline things or sometimes there was a twin and they didn't know about it, so they aborted the twin and the surviving sibling. And oftentimes in those circumstances, like that's a very specific kind of trauma. And, like Melissa Oden was left on a table to die until the nurse was like, I can't do this, and like saved her life. But in this instance, Even This Way is about siblings whose siblings died by abortion. Kind of like in a funeral or in the obituary would say like, so-and-so was preceded in death by other family members. Like that's kind of the audience that we're talking about here. And our capstone projects had to be, basically you would read it and you'd be able to implement it. So it's not just research for research sake. Mine became a grief intervention structure over the course of 2 weekends, similar to like Rachel's Vineyard, which is a post-abortion healing retreat, mostly in like Catholic dioceses and parishes, but mine doesn't have the Catholic focus necessarily, and it's also a 2-weekend focus. So some of the theories that I'll be talking about, really the foundational element of it is what Father John gave y'all, the CCMMP, and the gospel of life. The fact that we're individuals creating God's image and likeness, and John Paul II says that we have incomparable dignity. Abortion is a violation of that incomparable dignity. But we're also integrated. The CCMMP talks about the interpersonal nature of being human, and family is kind of that first unit that we think of. In the world, we always talk about abortion being a private choice, but the meta model in the gospel of life, basically, it says otherwise. Abortion affects the whole family. It affects surviving siblings. It affects future and living children of those parents who've had abortions. The idea is that the private choice can be detrimental to people's mental health, the psychology, and the spiritual lives of surviving siblings. And even though, like I've had people ask me, like, would you say abortion is evil? I would say, yes, I think it is an evil choice. I would also say that compassion is so needed in these circumstances and these kinds of conversations. And this whole project is not meant to be any kind of like act of judgment towards parents who have chosen abortion, like my own parent included. But oftentimes the choice of abortion is disguised as a good choice. And I think with the CCMMP as the base foundation of this project, for a Christian lens and for a Christian person that someone would be accompanying in this program, integrating the virtue of Christian hope is huge, because it's like the hope of the resurrection, and that this isn't the end, that death doesn't have a sting. So that's kind of just the basic level of this. But we can dive into some of the psychological theories that I came across in my research. So one interesting one was from Krell and Rapkin, and it was the effects of sibling death in the family. So basically this research was having to do with how a family responds to death, how they communicate specifically the death of a child in a family to the other living children, and how parental grief can impact the way they treat the living children. So that's this research. They basically highlighted 3 child roles: haunted child, bound child, resurrected child. So basically the living sibling, after another sibling's death, they could take on one of these roles based on the way their parents are going through their own grief. So a haunted child, that'd be like parents or a family who don't talk about the death of the child. It's a secret thing. I mean, it's known, but it's secret. There's shame involved. There's confusion. There's distrust. The child can't ask questions. They're haunted by the ghost of this sibling who died. Then there's the bound child. There's kind of two ways that someone could be a bound child. One, you could have like the helicopter parents. So the child is like overprotected. And it could be because the parent is experiencing guilt. Again, I'm looking at this through the lens of this is sibling survivors that I'm looking at. So if a parent had an abortion, they could feel that other child, oh, God's going to take away this child from me because I made an awful choice with my other child. So God's going to take away the child. I have to do everything to protect them from anything happening to them. Or on the contrary, a child could be a bound child in this family situation and be experiencing subtle rejection from their parent. So the idea of, oh, I don't deserve this child. Something is going to happen to that child, and I deserve for something to happen to this child. So I'm going to not show an emotional attachment to my living child. So that's haunted, that's bound. The third is the resurrected child. So this is when a child, whether they know it or not, is a replacement child for the one who died. So they might feel like a separation between who they are and who their sibling was, or their sibling was supposed to be. So they might have difficulty seeing differences between who they are and who the sibling was. So there's.
Can I ask about that real quickly?
Huh?
Do you mind if I ask about that?
Mm-hmm.
Would you think in the same family there could be different responses from the siblings?
Different, like if there are multiple siblings?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. I don't remember the research and the context of this research if they were talking about multiple siblings, but definitely. I think, like my friend, for instance.
These are all negative responses, right?
What do you mean? Yes.
Yeah.
Because it basically is implying that the parent doesn't know how to deal with their grief, and so they're not able to like love their child like in a true familial unit.
Did the studies mention like healthy coping at all?
Not that I remember. This was an old research too from '79.
Okay.
So when I look at this, I'm looking at it through the lens of like abortion, sibling death, but that's not what this study was on.
Correct.
So that's the first piece of research that I found interesting as I made this capstone. Next one is probably the most significant one by Dr. Philip Ney from UBC in Canada, published in 2010. He researched maternal pregnancy loss. So that included miscarriage, it included, also abortion, and he found that there were significant differences between people whose mothers had miscarriages and people whose mothers had abortions. One of those significant differences was that sibling survivors, my target audience here, they feel unworthiness, doom, lack of meaning in life, existential crisis, survivor's guilt, and they more than siblings whose siblings died by miscarriage, they are more likely to struggle with embracing life fully. So, an interesting anecdote that Ney gave, illustrating the differences between a family who lost a child by miscarriage and a family who lost a child by abortion. This is his anecdote. He says the family is walking on a beautiful cliffside by the beach, and the children are playing by the ledge. In the instance of miscarriage, it's like one of those children fell off the ledge by accident. Now, the surviving child will feel serious grief about their sibling, but they'll still be able to move on with life because ultimately it was an accident, so they can still find meaning in life. But he says in the case of abortion, it's like two siblings are playing on the edge, and the parents kind of talk to themselves like, we can only really afford one kid, which one should we knock off? Floop, and they push off one of the kids off the ledge. And even if the child doesn't see it or doesn't witness it in this beach setting, the way they can hear the child scream and everything, they know there's something about them that knows that it was intentional. And so they have those feelings of doom, survivor's guilt. Why wasn't it me? It could have been me. Distrust of your parents. Yeah, there's actually another, this wasn't like a psychological study necessarily, but there was some research with this other group who does post-abortion healing. And there was a lot of anecdotes about siblings who experienced what it was like to discover that their parents had abortions. And it was really interesting, like kind of the connections that Nay is talking about in this study, that those stories was just like sheets and sheets of people's stories and testimonies that they line up. But it's not just about the research and like how it affects people and how it affects siblings. Like I said, this capstone project is really something to implement. For intervention, some of the psychological theories and grief models that I used were Kubler-Ross and Kessler, very famous. Most of us know the 5 stages of grief, and in this context, it was from the book On Death and Dying, which was originally for people who were kind of in terminal stages of life, in the book right before they were going to die. And then later, those same 5 stages of grief in the book On Grief and Grieving was kind of relating grief to the family members. So again, very significant for this kind of capstone project. Kubler-Ross and Kessler never meant for the 5 stages model to make people see grief as linear or sequential. It's kind of actually a weakness of this model, is that some people will say it's too simplified. Some people say they don't experience those stages of grief. Some people say there's more stages of grief. Just because there's good ways to talk about grief and grieving and death and dying, that's not necessarily an intervention model. It's not a way to help people move forward with life. But I do think this is like the best starting point. And in fact, the intervention that I've kind of developed with this research, the first weekend for sibling survivors would mostly deal with this. And just identifying grief, learning how to cope with it, having language with it, seeing how different stages of grief might look in this circumstance. So that's what the first weekend is really focusing on. But the second weekend, like I said, it's not an intervention model. So the second weekend is focusing on Therese Rando's 6 R processes. So this is from the book, How to Go On Living When Someone You Love Dies. Long time.
I'd never seen Rando as the last name.
Really? Rando. So the 6 R's are recognize the loss, react to the separation, recollect and re-experience, relinquish old attachments, which those 4 would probably be more talked about in the first weekend intervention. Whereas in the second weekend intervention, it'd be more about the last 2, readjust and reinvest in life. Readjusting. Rando talks a lot about the new and the old life. For the case of sibling survivors, I would call the old self the person who didn't know about the aborted sibling, and the new self being the one upon the discovery. For a lot of sibling survivors, that's the moment that they can point to. In Nay's research, he talks about one of the experiences, or what he calls post-abortion survivor syndrome, or like the things that people experience. It's not so much that it's PTSD, where you can point to one moment and you might like have memories and you might have dreams about a moment. A sibling survivor more experiences something like extended, like over their whole life. Like think of those bound child, resurrected child. It's like something from their childhood they know they can't put their finger on. And so there's not a moment, it's just lifelong question mark, basically. Of like there's something that I've heard whispers about, maybe you heard an aunt talk about it too loud, and you're just basically your whole life trying to put something together. And for a lot of sibling survivors, when they discover they have an aborted sibling, it's not so much like whoa, this is crazy, I never knew that. It's like, that makes something from my childhood make sense. Mm-hmm. For instance, I knew a girl who, different from me though, because she shared the womb with her aborted sibling, as in she was...
Twins.
No, sorry, like as in she was born after the abortion. So her mom had an abortion and then her mom was pregnant again. She was the next child. My aborted siblings through my father. So I think there was a lot that I didn't experience that other siblings do. And she said when she was a little girl, she would just cry all the time. And she would look in the mirror, she would turn on the shower so no one could hear her, and she would just cry looking in the mirror as a 5-year-old. Like imagine like a kindergarten child. And she thought it was about her parents splitting up and stuff. And then way later in life in her 20s when she found out her mom had an abortion, the first thought that she thought in her head upon hearing it was, I was born in a womb of death. And then she said, she pictured herself as a 5-year-old crying in the mirror, and she said, that's why. Like some grief, like her body just knew.
Have you noticed anything different between it being an older sibling or a younger sibling?
So I'm an older sibling of my sibling, and like for me, a lot of my question marks weren't so much about like the way that I was raised by my mom. It was more that I never met my dad. So I had questions about that. I heard of a sibling who like always felt like someone was missing, and she was one of the older siblings. And she said when she was little, she would count. Always head counts. And she was like, someone's missing. And they'd be like, no, this is everyone. And then when she found out she had an aborted sibling, she was like, that's why. I always counted. There's also a study about a little girl. This is like a very specific case study. Her name was Layla, and I think it was in the 80s. And her mom had multiple abortions. And she was little, like 4, 5, or 6. She had these horrible traumatic dreams. And in her dreams, she felt like she knew that her mom had lost babies, but I guess she didn't know in what way. But she had dreams that like basically like that they were killed and her dad ate them. Like these are like keeping her up at night. She's just this little girl. But then when they revealed to her that you know mom had abortions, something like they talked to her in age appropriate ways, and then basically she was able to like kind of move forward from it, because before that it was just this like impending doom and fear, and then they were able to talk to her about it. That was an interesting study, but again that was just one case study. This isn't a study, but this is another sibling story of someone that I know. They had a dream that they were playing in a sandbox with their siblings, and they were like, these are some kids I don't know, but I know they're my siblings. And then the sandbox like took 3 of them and like sucked them into the sand like quicksand. And she was like, Mom, guess this crazy dream, like, isn't that weird? Like I knew those were my siblings, but they weren't my siblings. And it turned out their mom had 3 abortions. And they were just crying. Anyway, so those are just like stories, really.
In those instances, when the kid's sharing a dream that like the mom like recognizes as significant, did the mom like immediately share like that like she'd had abortion in the past, or did it just came up way later that she shared?
I've heard both stories. It depends. Like with a little girl, I think it was after a lot of play therapy that was coming out. Like she was revealing dreams. But yeah, like with some of my friends, like, they're teenagers or early 20s and they're telling their mom these stories, and their mom sometimes reveals it, but I know a friend whose mom had 15 abortions.
Wow.
And whenever he knew about one because he wrote a persuasive paper, pro-life paper, and like his mom would cry when he would show it to her. And he never knew why. And eventually, he found out that she had 1 abortion. They went on a Rachel's Vineyard together, and then at the retreat, he found out she had 14 more abortions on top of that. So that was, it sometimes takes mothers a long time to reveal that. So I feel like I kind of went backwards a little bit, but
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I just started telling stories. But anyway, the rando, our processes, the important 2 ones on the second weekend are readjust and reinvest in life. So the readjusting, again, is the finding who you are in the new life. So I think like knowing the Krell and Rapkin one, like saying, hey, this is the role that I played in my family. beforehand and knowing, hey, I don't want to stay in that role. Philip Ney would say that sibling survivors could never move on from life. I disagree with him on that, but he says like it's impossible for siblings to move on in life, to readjust and reinvest. He does think it's, like very detrimental, which I agree it is, but I don't think that it's impossible. So I think it's important with the readjustment phase, like the forgiving of the parents, the recognizing of the wounds, doing all the healing work involved with that. And then the reinvesting in life, which is the thing that Ney feels like we can't do. For me, even this way, just this research was a huge part of it for me. Talking about it, meeting other siblings. When I moved to California, I met a girl. Someone connected us because they knew both of our stories. And I never met her in person, I don't think, maybe one time. But the first time I talked to her on the phone, she sent me a pendant with I named my sibling at a Rachel's Vineyard retreat. So she sent me a pendant with my siblings' initials. And she told me something that really stuck with me, that, I always tell siblings, now our siblings, they've been praying for us all along the way, but now that we know each other, our siblings are like friends in heaven. And that's always been, I don't know if that's theologically correct or whatever, but it's always given me comfort. And like when I went on Rachel's Vineyard retreat, I pictured my sibling like with Jesus, and it gave me a lot of hope. All the experiences that Ney talks about, I felt, and now I had words for. So my reinvesting life was researching it, having words for it, recognizing that it's not like I'm the only person that ever felt these things. I think it was maybe a little harder for me too, because I was giving pro-life presentations talking about, hey, these are ways that babies die from abortion. Here's all the methods. And then one day it was like, yeah, my sibling died like one of these ways. And so that was really traumatic for me, which is why I left like full-time pro-life education. But like I said, I don't think it's impossible. I think especially through the Christian lens, that you have to implement hope in it for people, even if it's, letter writing or I think for younger kids, probably some sort of arts therapy. I think a lot of people I know with siblings who died by abortion, like the arts were a big part of our healing process. Even if you're not an artist, like painting or just doing something with your hands. So that's something that I have always been interested in researching more about. So final discussion notes. This is a prevalent issue, like especially for you guys who are going to be therapists. This is super prevalent. In 2014, Guttmacher Institute recorded 59% of abortions obtained that year were obtained by someone who already had one birth. So that implies that over 500,000 people have a sibling who died by abortion just in 2014, just in the US. I think it's safe to say that there are millions of sibling survivors like me, just based on these statistics and just kind of estimating them. There are about 1 million and up abortions per year in the 90s. That's the height of abortion in the US. I think everyone whose parents had abortions at those times, like they're probably my age and younger, so they're probably discovering it now. And they might have very complicated grief about it, which is totally understandable. I want to say too, like with even this way, like this has never been, like even though I went to a Catholic university and even though I worked for a pro-life organization, this to me has never been merely a pro-life ministry, merely for Catholics. Like I think it's important that this ministry would be for all siblings of all political backgrounds, everything, whatever they believe. But if they experience some complicated grief, they might, not want to judge their parents. There's a lot of different things that could be going on, but I want to be able to accompany anyone in any stage, any background with their grief, especially because I've experienced it. One way that we'd be assessing like the success of the intervention is by using what's called the Hogan Grief Reactions Checklist. Okay, let me see if I can remember exactly what I wanted to say about this. So basically this assessment would be taken before and after the intervention. This kind of checklist would be Likert scale kind of situation. And it would be focusing on the theoretical category because it measures a bunch, but I would focus on the one of personal growth, which measures sense of becoming more compassionate, tolerant, forgiving, and hopeful. So the hope would be that before and after you would see increased numbers in those items and decreased numbers in the categories of despair, blame, and anger. So most of the questionnaire would be the same both times, except the second one would have kind of longer form answer, just if you're interested in that kind of thing. So the conclusion though is that there's not a lot of research done on this. I think there's more research that could be done. I want to do more research personally on this. There are other post-abortion healing opportunities than just even this way. Actually, I discovered later that one called Lumina Ministries had been in existence like a decade before I started my research, maybe 15 years before I even started my research, specifically for sibling survivors. Unfortunately, I was never able to find them. When I found out about my sibling, I was researching on Google every week or so. I have a sibling who died by abortion, and I remember not being able to find anything, and that was really hard for me. But Lumina Ministries was there, and there's other Catholic and pro-life efforts too. So if you're interested, here's some of the references that I was mentioning today. I also have a copy of my big capstone project if you do want to read it. I also highlighted a lot of the ones that I talked about if you want to like just peruse it for a second, but also I can talk about any questions that y'all might have too.